Today I'm comparing the video quality of all the 4K codecs and frame rates that the Sony A7S III has and reviewing a bunch of test footage to see which combinations look the best. Hello everyone and welcome back. The Sony A7S III has quite a few video formats including XAVC HS, S, and S-i, and it can shoot between 24 and 120 frames per second in 4K. In the past, higher frame rate options in cameras usually meant a reduction in video quality, and given that the Sony A7S III has bitrate options between 30 and 1200 megabits per second, it's fair to assume that the videos containing more information might also have a higher quality image. I've already made a video discussing the differences between each codec and what frame rate, bitrate, and codec combinations the A7S III has, so I will not go over that in this video, but I will mention a few assumptions I had before starting these tests. Given that XAVC HS has roughly twice the amount of compression that XAVC S does, I'm assuming it will have a better looking image. As for XAVC S-i and its massive bit rates, I also think it should have a better looking image than S, and maybe as good as HS. However, given its intra-frame compression that saves every frame separately, this codec should look the best for moving shots where the scene is changing between each frame compared to long GOP compression that XAVC HS and S have. This means I had to figure out a way to introduce movement in the video, but make it repeatable so I could directly compare the details. My solution was to use a slider and try to record using the 180-degree shutter rule, as well as higher shutter speeds to reduce motion blur and freeze each frame. So this is the scene I made where I compared 24, 60, and 120 frames per second against each other to see if any detail is lost in higher frame rates. And then I compared the same frame rates in XAVC HS, S, and S-i codecs. I did this stationary on a tripod and then ran the exact same test using a slider, first using the 180-degree shutter rule and then cranking up the shutter speed for the second test. To keep exposure the exact same between each frame rate and proper shutter speed combination, I compensated the ISO by the same stops. Aperture stayed constant at 2.2 and I used the highest bitrate that each codec offered, all at 10-bit and 422. Last few things I wanted to test were the other characteristics of each codec. Would HS be more difficult to edit given its higher compression, and would SI be easier to edit because it's less compressed? The first round is comparing 24 frames per second in HS, S, and SI. HS and S both have bit rates of 100 megabits per second, and SI has 240. Zooming into 350%, I can tell you without any doubt that these all look the same. Hopefully this is still obvious after being processed through YouTube's compression. 60 FPS in HS and S have bit rates of 200 megabits per second, while SI has 600 megabits per second. Once again, these are all indistinguishable. It honestly looks like I just took one video and copied and pasted it 3 times in a row. I promise you, however, that my OCD did not allow me to make any mistakes. I made detailed notes and I checked every frame rate and codec combination more times than is remotely reasonable. Finally, 120 FPS in HS and S have bit rates of 280 megabits per second. For 120p SI, I had to jump into S&Q mode, which has a staggering 1200 megabit per second bit rate. Unsurprisingly, these once again look the same. They were only magnified by 317%, so they would match the other frame rates for when I compared them. So strangely enough, XAVC HS, S, and SI all look the same in all the frame rates, which is good or a little disappointing depending on how you look at it. I personally would have liked to see HS come out looking a little sharper, but it got me thinking, would the lower bitrate XAVC HS option potentially look just as good? Unfortunately, I didn't have the forethought to test this during my initial round of tests, so I had to set the whole scene up again. Hey, quick 9 seconds of your time. I just want to mention that I respond to every single comment, so leave any questions you may have down below. If you feel like hitting that like button, that would be awesome too. XAVC HS has bitrate options that are half of what S are. So 24 FPS HS is 50 megabits per second and S is 100 megabits per second. If the theory of H.264 versus H.265 is correct, the same amount of information should be stored, with HS just being able to pack that information into a smaller file size. Well, it looks like it checks out, with both of them looking the same. This is a little strange because if these two look the same, that means that the 50 megabit per second HS option looks the same as the 100 megabit per second HS option. There's no doubt that there's more information, but I'm not sure what info is actually being stored. Doing the same thing for 60 FPS, the bitrate is doubled once again. 100 megabits per second for HS option and 200 megabits per second for XAVC S. I am no longer surprised to see that they are once again the exact same. Last test for 120 FPS, there isn't as many bitrate options this time for HS. The lowest bitrate available is only 200, while XAVC S is still at 280. I screwed up my exposure on this one, so the HS looks a little darker, but I think it's clear enough that the details look the same in both. So those are the codecs, but what about the frame rate options? First test here is comparing 24, 60, and 120 FPS in XAVC HS. This one is great to see that they do in fact stay consistent and look the same, as older cameras often would see a drop in image quality at higher frame rates. Doing the same thing for 24, 60, and 120 FPS for XAVC S, you can see they are the same, as well as for XAVC S-i. These findings are overall really great and really speak to the quality of the A7S III, but it does make this review a little bit boring. Maybe something more interesting will be uncovered in the motion part of this test. Time for the slider. Unfortunately, I wasted a bit of time on this because all the lower shutter speed clips had way too much motion blur, even at 120 FPS slowed down to 20%. For the higher shutter speeds, I use 1/200th of a second for 24 FPS, 1/500th of a second for 60 FPS, and 1/1000th of a second for 120 FPS. 24 FPS was still too blurry, 60 was getting a little bit better, but still not quite as good for comparing details, and thankfully 120 FPS with a 1/100th of a second shutter was able to freeze the frame enough to retain detail. This one I actually was surprised to see that all three look the same. HS, S, and SI at 120 FPS. I really thought that SI would pull ahead with its massive file sizes, little compression, and all frames being saved separately. Each frame is clearly different, so I'm not sure what to think at this point. These results make me inclined to mention memory card choice. SI 4K 120 FPS and SI 1080 240 FPS are the only two modes that the Sony A7S III requires the ridiculously expensive CF Express Type A card. For those of you that are like me, I understand wanting to have access to every video mode that the Sony A7S III offers, but maybe these results will show you that it may not be necessary and potentially save you some money. If you are looking for info about which memory cards are needed for what video modes, check out my video where I test the compatibility of every single memory card the A7S III accepts with every single frame rate and codec combination that it has. So they all look the same, but how do they edit? I have a fully spec'd out 2020 iMac, but 422 just doesn't want to work as fast as I'd like. However, I think I noticed that working with SI seemed to process a little faster when compared to HS. My timeline did look like this towards the end though, so it's hard to say what was being processed at what moment. I'd say this part of the test was inconclusive and I'll have to test it further in the future. I would also like to see how each of these codecs hold up during color grading, as well as compared to the 8-bit options. Maybe that's where all the extra information is being stored in XAVC HS. So I think that does it. Every single codec and frame rate tested and compared, and at the end they all look the same anyway. Like I said earlier, here's the video discussing in more detail the codec, frame rate, and bitrate combinations that the Sony A7S III has. And this one is the extensive A7S III memory card test video. Be sure to hit that like button if you got any value or enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.